You're listening ad-free on Amazon Music. One September night in 2006, a man left his office and walked across the vacant parking lot towards his truck. When he climbed inside the driver's seat, he instantly noticed that the back left of his vehicle seemed to be sagging slightly. But before he could figure out why it was doing that, he thought he saw something moving in his peripheral vision off to his left. So he turned and looked out his window into the dark night, and there, only a few feet away from him, was a shadowy figure who began to raise their hands. While most of you will figure out what is going on early in the story, I would encourage you to stick around to the very end, because at the end, there is a very disturbing plot twist that is the primary reason people even know about this case. This story contains sexual content as well as graphic violence, and so listener discretion is advised. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, just as the 5-star review button is about to blow out the candles on their birthday cake, lean in and blow them out yourself. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. 46-year-old Thomas Montgomery was a company man. For the last 12 years, he had punched a time clock at Dynabrade Incorporated, a factory in upstate New York that made high-quality power tools, from industrial-grade sanders to wheel grinders. So, when Thomas woke up on a Monday morning early in May of 2005, his routine that day was pretty much the same as it had been for the more than 500 Mondays that had come before it. Hearing the alarm go off at around 5:30 a.m., Thomas automatically reached out an arm and shut it off before the sound could wake up Cindy, his wife of 16 years, who was sleeping in the bed next to him. Then Thomas got up, grabbed his work clothes, and headed for the bathroom. 15 minutes later, he was walking down the upstairs hallway of his family's modest 2-story house, past the bedrooms of his 2 daughters, one 12 years old and the other 14. After getting downstairs, he walked into the kitchen where he grabbed a cup of coffee and a quick bite to eat. As he sat at the kitchen table having his breakfast, he saw the family dog, Shadow, waiting at the back door, her tail slapping side to side. After he was done with his food and drink, Thomas pulled on a light jacket and a ball cap before opening the door and following Shadow outside into the chilly morning air. 15 minutes later, the dog was fed and back on her dog bed, the coffee cup and dirty breakfast plate were in the sink, and Thomas was climbing into his car and getting ready to back out of the driveway. But first, Thomas had to reach over his belly to pull on his seatbelt. And as he did this, he was reminded that he was a good 25 years and 50 pounds away from his physical prime, back when he was a U.S. Marine. Thomas had never seen combat while he was in the military, but his 6 years in the Marine Corps still gave Thomas a deep sense of pride, especially considering the fact that at the time, the United States Marine Corps was undertaking some of the most dangerous missions in the U.S. war against terror in Iraq. Pulling his mind back to the present, Thomas finally buckled his seatbelt, then started the car engine and backed out of the driveway onto the quiet residential street on the outskirts of Buffalo, the second largest city in New York State. After tuning the car radio to his favorite sports station, Thomas then headed north to pick up New York State Highway 5, which would take him to Clarence, New York, where Dynabrade was located. Settling back into the driver's seat, Thomas made the uneventful 12-mile drive from Cheektowaga, the town where he lived, to his company's factory and their surrounding sea of parking lots. Thomas found a parking spot shortly before 7 a.m., and then he hopped out of his car and walked inside the building to join the line of other Dynabrade machinists, all getting ready to clock in, put on their clear plastic safety glasses, and get to work. 8 long hours later, Thomas had clocked out and was back in his car headed home. In about half an hour, he'd be walking the dog again, and when that was done, he'd be taking his 2 daughters off to swim practice at the local swim club, where he spent so much time that the club had asked him to be its vice president. But as Thomas made the 20-minute drive back home, his thoughts had skipped ahead from swim practice and then dinner to how he planned to spend that evening. For years, Thomas had lived for his Friday nights. That was when he and some buddies from work got together to play poker. However, recently, Thomas had discovered a new hobby, one that was more exciting than poker and one that he could enjoy every night of the week. Thomas had discovered an internet website called Pogo.com. Launched in 1998, Pogo was a platform that offered everything from Scrabble and Monopoly to card games like Blackjack. If you signed up for a membership, like Thomas had, you could skip most of the ads. Players used tokens rather than real money, but you could exchange those tokens for rewards and prizes of real monetary value. Players created usernames and online profiles, and not only could they play games against each other and with each other, but they could also use the chat room feature on Pogo that allowed them to message other players in their game, as well as other Pogo users that were outside of their particular game. While some of the chat rooms were technically listed as being just for kids, and there were other digital rooms that were just for adults, in reality, Pogo generally relied on its members and players to self-enforce the age restrictions. Thomas was aware that the site was used primarily by young people. He and his wife Cindy were both active in their local church, and as a Sunday school teacher himself, Thomas overheard his students talking about Pogo all the time. Thomas also knew that one of his younger co-workers at Dynabraid, a 22-year-old named Brian Barrett, was also a big Pogo user. In fact, it was Brian's offhanded mention of the site that had led Thomas to check it out in the first place. But after Thomas signed up for the site, and he saw how much fun it was to get to play cards every night, he quickly stopped caring about the fact that he was likely one of the oldest people on there. In fact, he didn't even think about it. He hopped into different games and chat rooms without so much as looking at the age restrictions on them. So, back on that Monday night in May of 2005, after Thomas had walked his dog and taken his kids to swim practice and had dinner, after all that, he shooed his two daughters off of the family computer in the living room, and with his wife Cindy sitting nearby in her usual spot on the sofa watching TV, Thomas made himself comfortable and logged into Pogo. Just typing in his screen name, which was Marine Sniper, gave him a sense of satisfaction. Thomas had never actually been a sniper in the Marine Corps, but the name reminded him of his glory days in the service. Usually, on Pogo, Thomas would just go straight to the Texas Hold'em poker rooms, but tonight he decided to play a little blackjack. But Thomas had hardly started looking at his first hand when he heard a ping and saw he'd gotten a direct message from another player with the screen name Tall Hot Blonde. Her private message just said to him, "You're in the wrong room. This room is for kids." Thomas had a moment of panic. He hadn't checked to see whether this chat room/game room was for kids or adults, and suddenly he wondered what would happen to him if it was revealed that he was a 40-something-year-old man playing with kids. Would he be kicked off of Pogo? Thomas did not want that to happen. Thomas loved Pogo. Playing these online card games and chatting with random strangers in the chat rooms had become an escape from the daily drudgery of his job and his routine. It also took his mind off the fact that in the last year or so, he'd had more and more problems with impotence, and that had put a strain on his marriage. His wife, Cindy, wanted to talk to him about it and spend more time together. Thomas, on the other hand, wanted to just ignore it and be left alone. So it didn't take Thomas long to decide how he was going to respond to Tall Hot Blonde's message. A second later, Thomas, aka Marine Sniper, wrote back, "Don't worry, I'm 18 years old. What about you? How old are you?" While Tall Hot Blonde didn't tell Marine Sniper her real name, she did tell him that she was a 17-year-old high school senior who lived in Western Virginia. She liked sports, and she played on her school's softball and basketball teams, and she wasn't sure yet what she was going to do after high school. "And what about him?" she typed. "Are you really a sniper?" Sitting there in front of the computer screen, Thomas felt a sudden, intense rush of excitement. The question had given him a very unexpected thrill. He would never meet this girl, and here he had an opportunity to play the part of his much more interesting and exciting and exaggerated younger self. So, Marine Sniper told Tall Hot Blonde that, yes, well, soon he would be a sniper. He was a Marine recruit for now who went by the nickname Tommy. He was about to start boot camp soon, then he would go to sniper school, and then after that he would deploy to combat in Iraq. By the time Thomas had shut down his computer 2 hours later, Tall Hot Blonde had sent him pictures of herself wearing a small yellow bikini that showed off both her curves and her flat belly. She'd eventually told him that her real name was Jessica, but she went by Jessie, spelled Jessi. She had one brother, and her family lived in a small house in the backwoods of West Virginia where nothing exciting happened, at least not since she had come in first place in a local beauty contest back in 2002. As Thomas turned out the downstairs lights and went upstairs to join Cindy in bed, he kept seeing those pictures of Jessie. With her wide smile, shoulder-length straight blonde hair, and long tanned legs, she more than lived up to the promise of her screen name. Thomas was already secretly hoping that the next time he logged on to Pogo, Tall Hot Blonde would be waiting for him. Thomas was still thinking about those pictures of Jessie when he woke up the next morning, and as soon as dinner that night was over, Thomas headed straight for the family computer. A minute later, he was on Pogo. Despite telling himself that this time he was just going to play a couple of hands of Texas Hold'em and then log off, Thomas kept clicking on his Pogo chat feature inbox, hoping he would see a private message come through from Tall Hot Blonde. And he didn't have to wait long. As soon as he saw the words, "Tommy, is that you?" pop up on his screen, Thomas felt that same thrill course through him that he'd felt the night before. And this time, there was no hesitation at all. Thomas began to add one lie after another to the fantastical story he told Tall Hot Blonde about Marine Sniper Tommy. After that, every night over the next few weeks, Marine Sniper and Tall Hot Blonde told each other intimate details about their lives. While the real Thomas Montgomery still got up early every morning to go to Dynabrade and spend 8 hours making components for power tools, in the evenings, he became the man he had dreamed of being. While Thomas was overweight and balding, Marine Sniper was 6 foot 2 inches tall and 190 pounds of pure muscle. While Thomas came home after work and walked the family dog and took his daughters to swim practice, Marine Sniper had the broad shoulders that Jessie had said she liked, along with a black belt in karate. While Thomas wore glasses and covered his bald spot with a ball cap, Marine Sniper looked a lot like a younger red-haired version of Hollywood heartthrob Harrison Ford. Soon, Jessie and Tommy had moved off of the Pogo chat feature and had started emailing each other and using Yahoo's instant messaging feature. Jessie's instant messenger name was Peaches0617, while Thomas went by Tommy Loves WV Fox. WV Fox stood for West Virginia Fox, clearly an allusion to Jessie. When Jessie finally asked Tommy to send her a picture, Thomas sent the headshot of himself that was taken almost 30 years earlier when he had graduated from boot camp. Even though it seemed fairly obvious that his picture was very out of date, Jessie didn't care. She was totally infatuated, and her fascination only grew as Thomas started concocting a tragic and hard-luck backstory for Tommy that would make Jessie feel protective and sympathetic. According to Thomas, Tommy's father had also been a Marine, Tommy's mother had died of cancer, and that had been such a terrible blow that Tommy's life had gone completely off the rails. In fact, his decision to join the Marines and become a sniper was so he could finally just make a fresh start with his life after a high school cheerleader had threatened to ruin his life by accusing him of rape. When Thomas told Jessie that before meeting her online, his plan had been to commit suicide in Iraq, Jessie had begged Tommy to stay alive for her sake. Jessie worried endlessly about Tommy's safety, and she told him again and again that despite whatever mistakes he had made in the past, she was proud of him and would always stand by him. After reading that, Tommy told Jessie that the Marine motto, Semper Fidelis, which means always faithful, should be their motto too. Over the next 6 months, both Thomas and Jessie would become completely obsessed with their relationship, to the point where it was the only thing either of them ever thought about. Unlike 46-year-old Thomas, who struggled with impotence, 18-year-old Marine Sniper told Jessie that he had 9 inches worth of endowment. Meanwhile, Jessie sent Tommy dozens of pictures of herself. However, none of them were her in the nude. She was always wearing clothes or a bathing suit. But to Thomas, the hours he spent wondering what was under those bathing suits made her photos even more enticing. There was one picture in particular, the camera peeking up under her miniskirt from behind, that really stirred Thomas's imagination. Within weeks of meeting each other, Thomas and Jessie were having virtual sex every night, and Jessie was telling Tommy that she loved him. Whenever Thomas's wife, Cindy, walked over to him and asked what he was doing on the computer, Thomas would immediately click out of the chat and insist that he was just playing online card games. And because Cindy was always asleep by the time Thomas eventually came to bed, she wasn't aware of the fact that Thomas was routinely staying up until 2 or 3 in the morning, telling Jesse all about what his, quote, snake would like to do to his, quote, foxy lady down there in West Virginia. And when Cindy did try to talk with Thomas about spending more time together, one of the remedies that their minister had suggested when they sought help for Thomas's impotence, Thomas told her that it was her nagging and her criticism of him that had led to his impotence problem in the first place, and so he didn't want to spend more time with her. He wanted to spend less time with her. Shortly after Marine Sniper and Tall Hot Blonde's online relationship had become very sexual, Thomas informed her that he had graduated from Marine boot camp and was now on active duty, and before long he would be shipping out to Iraq. This is when Thomas introduced to Jesse his totally made-up father and former Marine, Tom Sr. His role would be crucial to keeping the Marine Sniper fantasy alive. With the creation of Tom Sr., Thomas would be able to keep his daily connection to Jesse, who would be able to chat with Tom Sr. whenever Tommy was busy being an active-duty Marine. And Tom Sr. would be able to pass her messages along to his son when Tommy eventually deployed to Iraq. In addition to speaking with Jesse every day online, either as Marine Sniper or through Marine Sniper's dad, Tom Sr., real-life Thomas also started calling 17-year-old Jesse every day of the week as he drove to and from his job at Dynabrade, claiming that those were the only times he was off duty from being a Marine. But even this added layer of connection to Jesse wasn't enough for Thomas, and in time, Thomas started to act very jealous. Whenever he noticed a new friend added to Jesse's MySpace page, MySpace was a very early social media platform, or saw that she was chatting with other people online in the public Pogo chat rooms, Thomas instantly suspected she had other boyfriends and therefore was cheating on him. And it was true that Tall Hot Blonde had become an accomplished cyber flirt and seemed to enjoy the power she had over Marine Sniper, who showed absolutely no interest in any other girls. Tall Hot Blonde and Marine Sniper had their first lover's quarrel when Thomas became convinced that Jesse was sending pictures of herself to other internet admirers. Jesse did not deny the accusation. However, she told Marine Sniper that she was devastated by what he was claiming. And so, to make Tommy feel better, she sent him a pair of her red G-string panties along with a silver Key to My Heart keychain. She sent the package to Thomas's real address. He had said that that was where his father lived and that he could forward any mail he got to Tommy wherever he was in the world. When Tommy received the panties, he forgave Jesse. However, his dad, Tom Sr., did not. Shortly after the panties arrived, Thomas, writing as Marine Sniper's father, Tom Sr., would send the 17-year-old girl a crude message calling her a bitch and accusing her of lying and trying to hurt his son. One evening, just before Christmas in December of 2005, so 7 months after first meeting Jesse on Pogo.com, Thomas once again chased his daughters off of the family computer and sat down to log into his Yahoo Instant Message account. For weeks leading up to that night, Thomas had begun talking incessantly to his coworkers at Dynabrade about how he was going to leave his wife, Cindy, and go to West Virginia to be with this new woman who had come into his life. 22-year-old Brian Barrett, who was the coworker who Thomas had overheard talking about having a Pogo account, wasn't really surprised to hear what Thomas was talking about. Brian had heard lots of the old-timers at Dynabrade going on and on about their big plans for escaping their lives. But Brian and the rest of Thomas's coworkers had no idea that Thomas's mystery woman was actually just a 17-year-old girl. As Thomas's instant messenger account loaded up on the computer, he glanced over at Cindy, who was in her usual place on the sofa watching TV. He barely noticed all of the Christmas decorations that his wife and his daughters had put up all over the living room that day. Because the only thing on Thomas's mind at that moment was what he was about to ask Jesse. He turned back to the family computer, and after exchanging a few casual messages with Jesse, Thomas got straight to the point. He told her that Tommy didn't know if he was going to make it out of Iraq alive. But before he shipped out, he wanted to marry Jesse. And would she have him? Jesse's answer came right away. Oh my God, yes, yes, she would marry her sweet, sexy Marine. The next night, when Thomas logged into his instant messenger account again, he saw excited messages from Jessie telling Marine Sniper that she was already planning their first night in bed together. It would be her first time, she told him, but she was more excited than nervous. She also told Thomas that from now on, even before they officially got married, she'd be referring to herself as Jessica Blair Montgomery. Days later, another package of Jessie's panties arrived at the Montgomery house, and along with them was a set of engraved dog tags that read Tom and Jessie, always and forever. Rationally speaking, Thomas knew that there was no way he could ever marry 17-year-old Jessie. But at the same time, he just could not accept that at some point he would have to give up not just Jessie, but Tommy, the Marine Sniper. And so, at some point, shortly after asking her to marry him, Thomas made up his mind. He decided he would find a way to marry Jessie and have a real life with her outside of the internet. And to do that, he needed to become 18-year-old Marine Sniper Tommy. And so, on January 2nd, 2006, while he was on a break at Dynabraid, he pulled out a piece of stationery with the company logo at the top and wrote a letter that was part New Year's resolution and part manifesto describing this vision he had for the future. It read, "On January 2, 2006, Tom Montgomery, 46 years old, ceases to exist and is replaced by an 18-year-old battle-scarred Marine. He is moving to West Virginia to be with the love of his life." Thomas also wrote in this strange letter that Marine Sniper had more than $2 million and would use that money to take care of Cindy and his 2 daughters, as well as help him build his new life with Jessie. At the end of this note, Thomas wrote, quote, "I wish I would know the exact time I would change to new Tom so I can prepare for it." After he signed his name to this letter, Thomas folded the piece of paper up and locked it in the toolbox he kept at work. In mid-March 2006, so 2 months after Thomas penned this New Year's resolution/manifesto, one of his daughters, who was home from school and waiting for her mom and her dad to get home, was researching an assignment on the family computer when she heard a ping. Thomas had accidentally forgot to log out of his instant message account before he left for work that morning. Okay, back to the story. And so the message that his daughter received came from Jessie, tall, hot blonde, and it was very sexually explicit and was clearly intended for Thomas. Thomas's daughter stared at the message, shocked. Could it really be for her father? Feeling sick, she pushed herself away from the computer and she called her mom, telling her there was something she needed to come home and look at. Hearing the strain in her daughter's voice, Cindy left work, and 15 minutes later, she was sitting at the family computer, scrolling through the hundreds of emails that her husband had written to a girl who went by the names Tall Hot Blonde and Peaches0617. Horrified, Cindy finally turned away from the computer and went upstairs and started searching through her husband's drawers and closet, where she would find a treasure trove of handwritten letters and pictures, lingerie, and a set of dog tags engraved with Tom and Jessie, always and forever. When Thomas finally pulled into the driveway that night, Cindy was waiting for him inside. As the mother of 2 teenage daughters, she could not believe that her husband had tricked and seduced a teenage girl who had never even been outside of the state of West Virginia into falling in love with an 18-year-old Marine who did not even exist. When Thomas stepped through the front door holding his car keys and lunchbox, he saw his wife standing in front of him. She looked sad and furious, and she was holding a handful of frilly girls' underwear, including a bright red G-string. Thomas knew, like a punch right to his stomach, that his wife knew his secret. And when he tried to act surprised, like he had no idea what Cindy was holding out to him, even trying to step around her into the hallway, Cindy was not convinced even for a second. Instead, she walked over to the family computer and began reciting out loud some of the lewd things Thomas had sent Jessie. Cindy told Thomas that what he was doing and what he had done was not only totally inappropriate and totally disgusting, but it was likely illegal. Jesse was a minor. And if that wasn't enough, Cindy told Thomas that his own teenage daughter had been the one to discover this raunchy affair. Cindy told her husband that he only had two options: give up this totally inappropriate, bizarre fantasy, or they could get divorced. As he stood there in stunned and guilty silence, Cindy told him that for now, he just needed to go away. Go walk the dog, go cut the grass, anything. But right now, she couldn't even stand to be near him. Thomas said nothing and turned around and walked back outside. As soon as Cindy was alone, she sat down at the kitchen table and composed a careful letter to Jesse. And as she slipped it inside of an envelope, she also enclosed a recent picture of the Montgomery family. "Let me introduce you to these people," Cindy had written. "The man in the center is Tom, my husband since 1989. He is 46 years old, and here are our two daughters, 12 and 14 years old." Cindy told Jesse that there is no Tommy, there is no Marine sniper. Cindy closed the note with a piece of advice for Jesse: do not trust the words you read on a computer. When Jesse got Cindy's letter, she was completely crushed. Before breaking off all contact with the 46-year-old man she now knew had been posing as Marine sniper, she sent Thomas a series of furious and hurt messages asking him how he could have done this to her and telling him he should have to go to jail for what he had done. For his part, Thomas, who still lived in the same house with his wife and daughters but slept in the basement, told Jesse he was sorry and that he never meant to hurt her. And Thomas told his wife Cindy that although he was totally ashamed of what he had done to her and to the family, he was relieved that she had found out, because the guilt and the stress of this double life had become an unbearable burden. And for the next 6 weeks, even though Thomas still occasionally logged onto Pogo.com to play cards, he did not hear another word from Tall Hot Blonde. But it would turn out, despite no longer communicating with Thomas, Jesse was nowhere near forgetting or forgiving what Thomas had done to her. She also began to wonder if maybe the letter she had received from Cindy was a trick. Maybe, thought Jesse, Cindy was really another girl who was also in love with Marine Sniper, and maybe Cindy had made up that whole story about Tommy being 46 years old and married with kids so that Cindy could have Tommy all to herself. Within 2 weeks of getting Cindy's letter and the picture of the Montgomery family, Jesse was back on Pogo, but this time she was looking for friends of Marine Sniper who could tell her the truth about him. On April 17th, Jesse got her answer. She had found another person online that Tommy had once mentioned to her. It was a user who went by the name Beefcake1572. He was a 22-year-old student at Buffalo State College who also worked part-time at a company called Dynabraid in upstate New York. This man's name was Brian Barrett. Again, the same Brian Barrett who Thomas had overheard talking about Pogo that had inspired Thomas to log into Pogo in the first place. And it didn't take much time in a private chat room for Tall Hot Blonde and Beefcake to put together all the pieces of the puzzle. It also didn't take long for Beefcake to fall completely in love with Tall Hot Blonde, who wasted no time sending him the same titillating pictures she had sent to Thomas. Jessie was Brian's ideal girl, blonde, beautiful, and athletic. When Beefcake confirmed that his coworker, Marine Sniper, really was 46-year-old Thomas Montgomery, and that he really did have 2 teenage daughters and a wife named Cindy, Jessie was crushed all over again. She was also very, very angry. As she and Beefcake got together in the Princess Priceless room on Pogo and played Lotso, which is a cross between bingo and the lottery, Jessie told her new admirer how hurt and heartbroken she was over Thomas's betrayal. It didn't take long for Beefcake to feel just as outraged as Jessie over the predatory and creepy behavior of this older man he once thought of as a good friend and coworker. So by the time Jessie got around to asking Beefcake if he would help her teach Thomas Montgomery a lesson, Brian, dazzled by Jessie's beauty and attention, was all in. He asked her, "What do you need me to do?" A couple weeks later, at the end of April, 46-year-old Thomas Montgomery logged onto Pogo. However, as soon as he was logged in, he got a message saying that his account had been suspended due to complaints of inappropriate activity. Stunned, Thomas logged off and started going on some of the other gaming sites he often visited outside of Pogo, and what he saw on them horrified him. On each of these other sites were forums where members of the site could post questions or offer insights or whatever they wanted to talk about, and then other people on the site could click on those individual posts and they could comment and interact with them. And when Thomas logged into each of these other gaming sites, the forum page where all these different topics are listed was the first thing he saw. And immediately, he saw his real name in several of these posts. And when he clicked on them, he saw the posts were all about how he was this 46-year-old predator and pedophile who posed as this Marine sniper. When Thomas checked to see who had written these posts, his heart sunk. They were all from either Tall Hot Blonde or Beefcake1572, who he instantly recognized as his co-worker, Brian. Meanwhile, Jesse and Brian became closer and closer. When Jesse suggested to Brian that he tell his coworkers at Dynabraid what Thomas had done, Brian didn't waste any time. He asked Thomas's coworkers if they remembered all that talk from Thomas about him leaving his wife Cindy and moving to West Virginia to be with this new mystery woman he had met. Then Brian put out the word that the mystery woman was really a 17-year-old girl that Thomas had met online by posing as an 18-year-old Marine sniper. It didn't take long for Thomas to start seeing the dirty looks and hearing the nasty comments all around work. He was now sure that half the people at his office thought he was a loser and a predator, and parents no longer wanted him to be around their kids. Also, Brian outright told Thomas that he and Jesse were now an item, and that every time they interacted, things got hot and heavy. At home, banished to the basement and now using his own computer, Thomas sent Jesse an instant message that hinted at suicide. It said, "You can say goodbye forever to me and Tommy." At first, Jesse was glad to see the damage her revenge campaign was doing to Thomas, and it was clear that Brian was also getting a thrill out of it as well. But eventually, Jesse started to feel bad about what was happening. And in a series of text messages that started a few weeks after she and Brian had begun publicly shaming Thomas, Jesse was back in touch with Thomas, telling him how much she missed her Tommy, and that Thomas was all she had left of her, quote, sweet, sexy Marine. Maybe, she told Thomas, they could just be friends, and together they could keep the memory of Marine sniper Tommy and the passion they had shared alive. But despite Thomas agreeing to this just be friends arrangement, his relationship with Jesse pretty much immediately became very sexual and intimate again, except now it was not just Thomas and Jesse, it was Thomas, Jesse, and Brian. Despite Jesse's promise to Thomas that she would end her relationship with Brian, she didn't, and instead she began going back and forth between the two men. And so in time, the hours that she and Thomas would spend messaging each other late into the night and early morning veered crazily between declarations of love and jealous outbursts from Thomas, who kept seeing Brian's username pop up alongside Tall Hot Blonde on Pogo, other gaming sites, and on Jesse's MySpace page. Meanwhile, the tension between Thomas and Brian when they were at Dynabraid together was palpable. Thomas was furious with Brian, not only for interfering with his relationship with Jesse, but for also very publicly humiliating him. And Brian, who had developed real feelings for Jesse, had become furious with Thomas and felt like he really was a predator and a pedophile and should just go away. Thomas and Brian would openly argue and fight with each other at work, and then when they went home, they would get online and spend hours accusing each other of telling lies about their relationship with Jesse. But by mid-May, Brian was just tired of the drama. And so he told Thomas that he was just going to go to West Virginia and he was going to see Jesse in person and likely become intimate with her in person, and then she would be all his. Even though Jesse told Brian, no, do not make a trip to West Virginia, the damage to Thomas was done. From that moment forward, Thomas became obsessed with the idea that Jesse and Brian were going to take their relationship out of the cyber world, where Thomas felt like he had a chance with Jesse, into the real world, where 46-year-old Thomas stood no chance. By early September 2006, this obsession had made it impossible for Thomas to be even remotely civil with Jessie. His messages to her had become so crude and so violent that Jessie had just begun to ignore them. And when she did this, it only made Thomas more angry and more obsessed. At 10:16 p.m. on the night of September 15, 2006, Brian clocked out of his shift at Dynabraid. It was 63 degrees Fahrenheit and cloudy outside. The quiet and the light northeast breeze were a welcome relief after the noise and bright lights inside the machine shop. As Brian walked across the nearly vacant parking lot, he kept his head down and fished his car keys out of his pocket. When he got to his white pickup truck, he polished a small smudge off the driver's side door before opening it up and hopping inside. Before Brian put his keys into the ignition, he paused and noticed that the back left side of his truck seemed to be sagging slightly. But before he could figure out why it was doing that, he noticed off to his left in his peripheral vision, a shadowy figure was moving across the lot toward him. 2 days later, early on Monday morning, September 18th, Clarence, New York police got a 911 call from the security guard at the Dynabraid equipment factory. He just found the body of a young man who'd been shot dead at close range inside of his white truck that was parked in the Dynabraid parking lot. By the time the police arrived, so too had the first shift of Dynabraid workers. As the police set up a perimeter around the crime scene, co-workers stood by in total disbelief. Based on interviews with Brian's family who had not seen him all weekend, and with his co-workers who identified his truck and his body, along with records that showed when Brian had last left the Dynabraid factory, it only took police a few hours to come up with a preliminary theory about what had happened. Whoever killed Brian must have taken the young man by surprise. Brian sat slumped in the driver's seat of the truck, leaning slightly towards his right, away from the closed window with the 3 bullet holes punched through it. There were bullet wounds in his upper left arm and jaw, and a gaping hole in the left side of his neck. Police noticed that Brian's back left tire on his truck was flat, and when they checked, they saw someone had punctured it with a knife. Also, a .30 caliber carbine rifle shell casing, as well as a peach pit, were discovered at the scene of the crime. Brian's family was devastated. They had absolutely no idea who might have wanted to harm their eldest child. When police interviewed Brian's parents, neither of them were aware of any problems or arguments that Brian was having at home, at school, or at work. But once police began interviewing Brian's co-workers at Dynabraid that Monday morning, they heard a very different story. It seemed to be common knowledge that Brian had had a serious falling out with a co-worker who had been acting more and more erratically in recent weeks. That co-worker's name was Thomas Montgomery, and it seemed like the two men had both been involved in an online relationship with the same woman, except she wasn't really a woman, she was actually a 17-year-old girl. Unable to locate Thomas, police were concerned, if he really was the killer, that Jessie, the 17-year-old girl, could be in danger. So police in New York went through Brian's cell phone and found contact information for Jessie, and then contacted authorities in Oak Hill, West Virginia, and asked them to do a welfare check on the girl. But before the West Virginia police could conduct that check, detectives in New York got in touch with Thomas and pulled him in for questioning. Thomas denied that he had anything to do with Brian's murder, saying that he had been at a local restaurant the night before and had arrived home sometime between maybe 10 or 10:10 p.m., which meant he would have been home when Brian was still alive and inside the Dynabraid factory. Thomas would admit to police that yes, he and Brian both did meet the same girl online, Jessie, and they had been squabbling over her. But Thomas said he would never hurt Brian. But it wasn't until investigators in New York heard back from police in West Virginia and tracked down additional cell phone data and spoke with Cindy Montgomery that they were able to piece together who had really killed Brian and why. At 1:33 a.m. on September 13th, 2006, so 2 days before Brian was killed, Jessie heard the ping of an incoming instant message. When she looked at her computer screen, she saw that it was from Thomas. It said, "You're a whore, and that's all you ever will be." For weeks, ever since Brian had told Thomas that he planned to drive to West Virginia to see Jesse in person, Thomas's messages to Jesse had become extremely abusive. Jesse had tried to calm him down, to get him to become once again her sweet, sexy Marine sniper named Tommy, but it just wasn't working. And so now, seeing this new message come across, Jesse took up a new strategy. She began ignoring him, and this drove Thomas mad. A day later, on September 14th, Jesse heard the ping of yet another incoming message, asking her if she planned to have sex with one of her boyfriends that day. Again, Jesse just ignored him. A day after that, early on the morning of Friday, September 15th, the day Brian was killed, Thomas woke Jesse up with a phone call, screaming at her in an uncontrollable rage. She hung up on him. Thomas Montgomery had reached a mental tipping point. On one hand, he knew that he could never really have a real life with Jesse. He also knew that his jealousy and rage were getting out of control. But the same part of him that had written out that New Year's resolution/manifesto back on January 2nd, 2006, felt that he still possessed somewhere inside the young Marine sniper whom Jesse had loved and who represented to Thomas the best version of himself. And so on September 15th, after screaming at Jesse on the phone and hearing the click as she hung up on him, Thomas made up his mind. He had waited long enough for his transformation from middle-aged machinist with a wife and 2 daughters into that battle-hardened Marine sniper who could and would defend what was his. That evening, Thomas told his wife, Cindy, that he was going to go out to dinner by himself. Once outside in his car, he looked in the back seat to make sure his supplies were all there. Then he turned on his car and drove to a fast food place near Dynabrade. After eating, Thomas left the restaurant and drove the short distance to Dynabrade. Entering the parking lot behind the factory, Thomas chose a parking space that was far away from the door where he knew Brian would exit. After his car was parked, Thomas climbed out of his vehicle. He was glad it was cloudy, and he was glad that the parking lot where he now stood was almost empty except for Brian's white pickup truck. Thomas finally finished eating his peach and dropped the pit onto the parking lot pavement. Now, as a Marine sniper, Thomas had to get the timing of this mission exactly right. He needed to get close enough to the truck to take his kill shots before Brian had a chance to drive away, but he also had to let Brian get into the truck without giving away his own position. And on his way in for the kill, he needed to make a silent puncture with his knife in the back left tire. This was his insurance policy. In case Brian did see him, it would make it very difficult for him to escape. Just after 10:16 p.m., the factory door opened and Brian walked outside into the parking lot. Brian didn't even look up as he walked towards his truck. To Thomas, what he was about to do almost seemed too easy. As soon as Brian had climbed into the truck and closed the driver's side door, Thomas was there like a shadow. And a second later, he had fired 3 shots through the closed window. Even through the blood spatter on the inside of the car window, he saw the massive hole in Brian's neck and knew that he was dead or was definitely going to die. Backing away from the truck, Thomas quickly returned to his own car, not realizing that he had dropped one of his shell casings. On his drive back to his house, Brian hoped his wife and daughters would be asleep. That way no one could contradict him when he said he'd gotten home that night before Brian had actually left the factory. But when police did interview Cindy a few days later, she would tell them that it was her recollection that her husband had not arrived home on the night of Brian's murder before 10:16 p.m. Cindy estimated that it was closer to 10:45 p.m. or later. And when police arrived at Dynabrade to question Thomas, he made a remark that instantly connected him in the minds of investigators to the peach pit they had found at the scene of Brian's murder. Thomas asked police if they could wait just a minute before questioning him so he could get the peaches he'd brought in for lunch out of his car so they wouldn't spoil in the sun. Although Thomas refused to give police a DNA sample, the police were able to pick up his DNA from a can of soda, and they found that it matched the DNA on the peach pit they'd found at the murder scene. A search of Thomas's house did not turn up a .30 caliber carbine rifle, but it did turn up an old photo of Thomas's gun cabinet that contained the exact same gun. Thomas's computer told investigators the rest of the story. In thousands of messages and emails to Jesse and Brian, coupled with his collection of Jesse's lingerie and other gifts, Thomas detailed his obsession with Jesse and his jealousy and growing hatred for Brian. Later, police would also discover the letter that Thomas had written that he kept locked in his toolkit at work. It was his New Year's resolution/manifesto that described wanting to leave 46-year-old Thomas Montgomery behind and become, instead, his 18-year-old alter ego, Marine sniper Tommy. On November 27, 2006, 2 months after Brian's death, police arrested Thomas and charged him with murder. And it was at this time that Thomas learned he was not the only person pretending to be someone else online. When West Virginia law enforcement arrived at Jessie's house to do that welfare check on her, her mother arrived at the door. When police told her that her daughter, Jessie, was in danger following the murder of a man she had likely been involved with online, the woman was shocked and told them that Jessie was not home. When police told her that they really needed to get in touch with her immediately and go get her in their own vehicles if necessary, the mother suddenly broke down and started crying, and then told police that she really did have a daughter named Jessie. But that was not the Jessie they were looking for. She, the mother, a slightly overweight 46-year-old housewife with short brown hair, whose real name was Mary Sheeler, was the 17-year-old girl, tall, hot blonde. It would turn out, for more than 16 months, Mary Sheeler had used her daughter's real identity to enter into multiple online relationships with men, sending them, just as she had sent Thomas and Brian, hundreds of pictures of the real Jessie, her daughter. When investigators asked her why she did this, Mary said she had joined Pogo to relax and kill time. After that, she enjoyed the drama and power and attention she got from manipulating the emotions of her many online admirers, none of whom she loved. In fact, she told investigators she was happily married to her husband of 23 years and was very devoted to her daughter, who had no idea any of this was happening and was off at college. But all that would change when the real 18-year-old Jessie discovered her own pictures and name all over the internet, along with details of how her own mother used her identity as bait for a catfishing scheme that left one man dead, one in prison, and 2 families in ruins. When police arrived at the jail and showed Thomas Montgomery a picture of the real tall, hot blonde, 46-year-old Mary Sheeler, the color from his face drained. Then, without saying a word, he turned around and faced the wall. He would eventually plead guilty and would be sentenced to 20 years in prison. There were no charges that could be brought against Mary Sheeler for catfishing, but her husband would divorce her, and her daughter, Jessie, would sever all ties with her. In 2014, Alan Ruby was a 19-year-old freshman studying political science at the University of Oklahoma. Despite being relatively modest and soft-spoken in person, on social media, he projected this lifestyle of wealth and grandeur. He'd oftentimes post pictures of exotic sports cars and expensive watches and clothes, and he would travel the world to Paris, London, New York City, and take all these pictures showing off this incredible life he had. He really wanted people to believe that he was this fabulously wealthy, successful guy. Alan was only able to project this phony lifestyle on social media because he was spending his father's money. His father was a successful businessman who was also the publisher of a newspaper that was quite successful, and so Alan would just spend his money, and then even after his father would give him money, Alan would steal his credit card and additionally rack up thousands of dollars of credit card debt. But as media began to shift away from print media to almost all digital, a lot of newspapers began to fail because they weren't able to transition to digital. And his father's newspaper was not making that transition very well, and they were losing money left and right. And so Alan's father told everybody in his family, with a focus on Alan, that we all need to cut back on our spending because money's tight right now and it's unclear if it's going to turn around. So we got to be careful with how much money we do have. Alan acted like he was going to cut back on his lavish lifestyle, but in reality, he wasn't going to. He was totally addicted to spending money and giving off this vibe that he was so wealthy and successful. And so around this time, Alan steals his grandmother's credit card and secretly leaves the country and goes to Paris to have this vacation on his own. He's taking these pictures in front of the Eiffel Tower and he's spending all this money. And his father finds out that he's stolen this credit card and he's furious. And instead of waiting for Alan to come home and saying, "Don't do that again," he decides he's going to send him a message that he's going to remember. And he calls the police. Alan gets charged with theft, he pleads guilty, and he has to go before a judge who sees that he has no criminal record, so he kind of goes easy on him, and he says that you need to pay back all the money you spent to your grandmother, and you need to go to an addiction program to try to break this habit of yours, to stop spending all this money. After Alan leaves court, his father felt like he finally got the message. It seemed like it had finally gotten through to him that this was a really big problem, and he felt like he had made the right decision in calling the police. But in reality, Alan hadn't changed at all. As soon as he got back from court, he was stealing from people outside of the family, he was taking loans from loan sharks, all of this just to keep up with his phony appearance he portrayed on social media. On October 9th, 2014, Alan owed $3,000 to a particular loan shark and had no way of paying it back. So instead of asking his parents for money, which for him would have been too embarrassing, he decides the best course of action is to kill his entire family. And so he strolls into his home and he shoots his mom dead, he shoots his sister dead, and then he waits for his dad to come home and he shoots him dead because his big plan is, with his whole family gone, he's going to become the sole heir to the family's estate, and that will be enough money to not only pay off this $3,000 debt, but have a little left over so he can go on vacation to Paris again. So after he's committed this horrible crime, he leaves his family where they are. He goes and takes the surveillance footage from inside the house. It was on a DVD, takes the DVD out, takes the murder weapon, leaves the house, chucks the DVD and the weapon into a lake, and proceeds to drive to Dallas, where he checks into a very fancy hotel and meets up with friends and parties the whole weekend. His friends that were with him that weekend would later tell investigators that Alan seemed totally normal. There was no red flags. There was no indication that anything was wrong. He was just laughing it up and having a great time that whole weekend. The following Monday, when Alan's father doesn't show up for work, the police are notified. They go to the house and they find the Ruby family. When police went out and got Alan and brought him back to the station to chat with him and tell him what happened and see if he knew anything, his sad reaction to his whole family now being deceased was apparently so insincere that officers almost immediately assumed that he was probably the guy that did it. Ultimately, Alan would confess, and the prosecutor wanted to push for the death penalty, but Alan's remaining living family members actually said, "Don't do the death penalty. We don't want to risk that not happening. We want to see justice served right now. Can we create a plea agreement where he gets life in jail, but there's absolutely no way for him to get paroled, no matter how good his behavior is, no matter how old he is, no matter what, he can't ever get out of jail." And so they did. They created that plea agreement. They gave it to Alan to sign. He signs it, and as they're walking out of the courtroom, his last remaining family members disown him and say, "May God have mercy on your soul," and they leave. The next and final story of today's episode is called Western Russian Farm Animal. At around 9 p.m. on March 3rd, 2022, a 31-year-old woman named Corey Richens tucked her 3 young sons into their beds and then headed downstairs to her kitchen inside of her luxurious home in suburban Utah. Once she got down to the kitchen, she yelled out for her husband, whose name was Eric, to come join her in the kitchen. Corey had some big news that she had just learned that day, and now that their kids were all tucked away in their beds and were off to sleep, she and her husband could celebrate this big news and share a drink together. A moment later, Eric walked into the kitchen and Corey grinned at him and handed him his drink and then gestured for them to go upstairs to their bedroom. And so the two of them went upstairs, they sat down on the bed, and then Corey broke the big news. Corey's tiny real estate company had just found out that day that they were very likely going to close on a deal for this gorgeous 20,000 square foot mansion in Utah for $2 million. Now, Corey knew once she bought this property, she could do a couple of renovations to it and then quickly sell it for $3 million, meaning she was about to make a $1 million profit. Corey had been working really hard on her real estate business for years, but this really represented the first big break. She and Eric lived in a very conservative part of Utah where it was kind of expected that someone like Corey would stay home with the kids and be a good housewife, and that would be her life. But Corey didn't really want that. She wanted to have a professional career that was kind of on par with her husband's. Eric ran a very profitable masonry company that allowed the family to take vacations to Mexico and Spain every year, and also to afford their sprawling property at the end of the cul-de-sac. Corey had stayed home when the three boys were much younger, but now that they were 5, 7, and 9 years old, they had decided to hire a nanny, which had allowed Corey to finally go out and pursue her professional dreams. And so, totally beaming with pride, Corey sat there on the bed and clinked her husband's glass and went over all the details of this deal and talked about how great their lives were about to become with all this additional income. But fairly quickly, both of them decided they were too tired to stay up and celebrate any longer, especially Eric, who earlier that day had gotten an allergy shot and it had totally knocked him out. He was feeling kind of weak and tired. And so the two of them decided to just go to bed. And so after brushing their teeth and changing, they got into their bed, they turned off the light, and they were about to lay down and go to sleep when they heard their 7-year-old crying in his bedroom. And both parents let out a groan, and then Corey, she stood up, indicating she would handle this because they knew often their 7-year-old would have nightmares, and the only way he would go back to sleep was if his mom laid with him. And so Corey, she kissed Eric, and then as Eric rolled over to go to bed, Corey walked out of the room, she went down the hall, went into her son's bedroom, she got under the covers, and then before long, she and her son had fallen asleep. A few hours later, Corey suddenly sat up inside of her son's bed. It was about 3 a.m., and for a second, she couldn't even figure out where she was. The house was silent, it was totally dark, and she was confused. But then she remembered she had gotten up to tend to her son, and so she checked on her son, she saw he was still sleeping, and so she climbed out of the bed, she tucked him back in, she gave him a kiss, and then she left his room, went down the hall, and went back into her bedroom, where she climbed into her bed. Then she saw that Eric had kicked off all the covers, and he was sleeping on his back. And so Corey laid down on the bed and kind of rolled up right against her husband, and she pulled the covers up over both of them, and then she closed her eyes to go to sleep. But right as she did that, she noticed something very strange. Eric's body felt freezing cold. Corey opened her eyes and sat up in bed. She turned over and kind of pushed Eric to see if he would sit up and figure out why he was so cold. But Eric didn't budge, and when she pushed him, he felt really heavy, like dead weight. And so suddenly starting to panic, Corey yelled Eric's name several times, but Eric didn't budge. And so Corey leapt from the bed, she grabbed her phone, and she dialed 911. And when the dispatcher picked up, Corey was so hysterical as she's looking at her husband lying motionless in his bed that she could barely tell the dispatcher what was going on. But finally, she did get it out to the dispatcher, and the dispatcher said, "Stay calm, the ambulance will be there as soon as we can." And so just moments later, Corey heard the sirens outside, and so she ran downstairs, she flung the door open, and practically cried with relief as the paramedics charged into the house. But when the paramedics got upstairs into the bedroom and they went to go revive Eric, they saw right away it was already too late. Eric was dead. First responders had no idea what killed Eric. He seemed like a really healthy, fit guy who actually just the day before had gone for a casual 8-mile run, and he was also this big outdoorsman, always going on hikes and going on these long hunts. And so the idea that this guy had just suddenly died seemed really suspicious. The police did find a painkiller pill bottle on the bedside table next to Eric's side of the bed, and for a second they thought, well, maybe he overdosed on painkillers. But when they looked at the label on this pill bottle, it was immediately clear that this was a really old pill bottle and almost certainly had been empty for some time. When they asked Corey what she thought might have happened, she was totally in shock, but she did say, I don't know. I have no idea what happened to him. But, the day before, he did get that allergy shot and he had a kind of adverse reaction to it and really wanted to go to bed quite early, which seemed odd. But both Corey and the first responders agreed that it seemed pretty far-fetched that an allergy shot would lead to Eric's death. Suicide was also considered a possibility by first responders, but Eric really didn't have any reason to want to harm himself. He was a very devoted and loving father who adored his sons. He coached all their sports teams and went on all these adventures with them and was always out back kicking a soccer ball around with them. And his business was booming, and he had just learned that night that his wife's business was potentially going to start booming as well. And so ultimately, the police told Corey that we're just going to have to open an investigation and try to figure out what happened, and we'll be in touch. And if you think of anything that might help the investigation, please let us know. And Corey said, of course, I'll tell you, but she really wasn't listening. All she was thinking about was her 3 sons who were still sleeping in their beds and had no idea their dad was now gone. Over the next few weeks, while the family waited for autopsy results, Corey really focused her energy on her 3 boys, who were really hit hard by the loss of their dad. Eric had been such a hands-on father that his absence was enormous in these boys' lives. The 5-year-old kept asking, "Where's Dad and when can I see him again?" The older 2 boys, who did sort of understand that their dad was dead, would also ask questions like, well, can Dad still see us or can Dad still hear us? And these questions broke Corey's heart because she did not have an adequate answer to any of them. And so she tried to find a children's book online and in bookstores that dealt with grief in hopes that that would kind of help her sons deal with what they were going through. But none of the books she got helped at all. And so, a few weeks after Eric's death, when still nobody knew anything about how Eric died or what had really happened, Corey decided that she would take a different approach to helping her sons grieve. Instead of trying to read a book that somebody else wrote about how to handle grief, Corey just called her sons around one night and began telling them a story about their dad. And as she told them this kind of made-up story about their dad being this angel that was taking care of them, she began drawing pictures with a crayon and paper of their dad with wings and a halo, and she'd draw the kids down below waving up at their dad, and she would tell the boys that your dad is an angel now, and he's looking down on you, and he can hear you, and he loves you. And this really seemed to work for the boys. It was like for the first time since his passing that the boys kind of connected with the fact that their dad was gone, but they still had this meaningful connection with him. And so very quickly, Corey's stories about their dad and the illustrations that would go with them became a ritual. Every night, Corey would tell these stories and draw these pictures. And so, as the days and weeks went by, with still no word and no closure about what happened to their dad, Corey had a sort of epiphany. These stories Corey told her kids about their dad and how now he was this angel looking out for them, she could see firsthand how powerful it was and how really it was helping her sons cope with this loss. And she thought, why don't we turn our stories and all these illustrations into an actual grief book for kids? That way other families whose children are dealing with loss can read these stories as well and find some comfort. After all, Corey knew firsthand there really weren't any good grief books on the market. And so she knew for those that needed this, this would be huge. On April 13th, so 6 weeks after Eric had died, and several weeks after Corey and her kids had begun officially writing this kid's grief book, Corey was backing out of her driveway when from the other end of the cul-de-sac, she saw a police car coming down the way, and it was the lead detective on Eric's case, Detective Woody. And as the detective came down the road, he was waving to Corey, clearly getting her to stop for a second. And so Corey, she parked her car, she hopped outside and went up to talk to him. And immediately, Detective Woody got out of his car, he walked up to Corey, and with a grave look on his face, he told her that he had some big news for her and it was going to be pretty upsetting, but he knew he had to tell her in person and right away. He told her that the autopsy results were in, and they determined that Eric had not died of natural causes. He had actually died from a fentanyl overdose. Fentanyl is a very powerful opioid that's often mixed with heroin, and just a little bit of fentanyl can kill someone. And Eric, it would turn out, had 5 times the lethal dose of fentanyl in his system. Corey was totally shocked at this news and told the detective that Eric didn't do drugs. The only drug he did was periodically he would eat a marijuana gummy before bed, but that was it. So this really didn't make any sense. The detective was respectful and kind of nodded his head and said, I totally understand that, but these are the results, and we need to find out where he got fentanyl from, and so we're going to need to search all of the electronic devices in your house to see if we can find communication between your husband and whoever got him the fentanyl. Corey told the detective that of course they could do that, but as she began thinking about all of their devices, she suddenly remembered that Eric's business partner, Cody Wright, had actually taken Eric's laptop very shortly after Eric had passed away. Now, Corey didn't know why Cody had taken the laptop, but Cody had been a thorn in both Corey and Eric's side for several years now. Eric and Cody had been very close friends when they had started their masonry business together about a decade earlier, but they'd had a serious falling out a few years back. The two men had been on this elk hunting trip, and at one point Eric had illegally shot and killed a bull elk, and Cody had actually reported Eric after this hunting trip to the game wardens. And as a result, Eric got in a lot of trouble and was temporarily banned from hunting anywhere in Utah. The two men still managed to continue to work together and build their masonry business, but it was very clear their relationship was totally fractured and would never be repaired. Now, Corey didn't get into all the details of the tensions with Cody, but she did tell Detective Woody that, if you want access to Eric's laptop, you gotta go talk to Cody because he took it for some reason. And also, you really just ought to talk to Cody in general because, maybe he has more to do with what happened to Eric and this whole fentanyl thing than he's letting on. The detective told Corey that he appreciated the information and he appreciated being allowed to go in and collect all the devices, and that he would go talk to Cody and try to retrieve Eric's laptop. And then after that, the detective thanked Corey and said they'd be in touch soon. But after this conversation with Corey, the investigation into Eric's death kind of stalled out. When police did follow up with Cody, they didn't find anything really worth pursuing. And outside of talking to Cody, no new information came in about Eric's death or about, his connection to fentanyl. And so really there was nothing for police to operate on. And so while the family just kind of waited for more information to come out about whatever happened to Eric, Corey just focused her energy on taking care of her 3 boys and writing this grief book with them. And finally, on March 5th, 2023, so almost exactly a year after Eric has died, and still police have no idea what happened to him, the grief book was finally done, and Corey self-published it on Amazon under the title, Are You With Me? And right away, the book was a total hit with parents of grieving children. And as the 5-star reviews poured in, so too did requests from local media for Corey to be interviewed and talk about this book and why she wrote it and how her kids are doing. Corey had no idea her book would be this successful, and so at first she was really terrified to do any of these interviews, but eventually she decided she would just say yes to all the interviews because she was very proud of what her and her kids had created, and she knew Eric would be proud too. However, what Corey didn't know was there was going to be a massive unintended consequence from publishing this book. Ever since Eric was found dead in 2022, the police in Utah began painstakingly searching all of the electronic devices that the Richens owned and that Cody, Eric's business partner, owned. And basically, they were just looking anywhere for some sign of communication between Eric and whoever had given him the lethal fentanyl dose. And at some point during the search of all these devices, the police found something very unusual. And they knew it very likely had to do with Eric's death. But they didn't really have any evidence to prove that, and so they just had to kind of sit on it and wait to see what happened next. And what happened next was, shortly after Corey published her grief book, it got all this media attention, and in turn, because of this attention, Eric's death, specifically the unsolved nature of his death, also got a lot of media attention. And eventually, several people who kept seeing all this news about Eric's unsolved death reached out to police and said, you know what? He did not overdose on fentanyl. He was murdered, and I'm almost positive I know who did it. And lo and behold, the alleged killer that all these people brought up to the police was the same person that the police in Utah had become suspicious of because of all those unusual things they had found during their search of all of the electronic devices. And so, on May 8th, 2023, not long after getting all these tips about this alleged killer, the police in Utah felt like they finally had enough ammo to go after this person, and they headed out to make an arrest. While we don't know for sure what happened, because again, this story, it's ongoing. This case has not even gone to trial yet. Here is what prosecutors say really happened to Eric Richins on March 3rd, 2022, the night he died. That night, Eric was upstairs when he heard Corey down in the kitchen calling for him, saying to come down and join her. And so he went downstairs, he went into the kitchen, and immediately he saw his wife grinning ear to ear, and she promptly handed him a drink and said, I have big news and we're going to celebrate. And after the two of them went up to their bedroom, Corey told Eric all about this big real estate deal and how their company was about to profit $1 million. And then after that, they clinked their glasses together, said cheers, and took a sip from their cups. The drink that Corey made for both of them was called a Moscow Mule. It's made with ginger beer, vodka, and lime. But when Corey mixed Eric's Moscow Mule, she added one additional ingredient, a lethal dose of fentanyl. It would turn out Corey had been stealing money from Eric's bank accounts, and he had found out. Eric also had discovered that Corey had been taking out these massive loans in their family's name, which Eric was really upset about. In fact, Eric was so upset with Corey that he wanted a divorce and was talking to a divorce lawyer and making sure after the divorce was finalized that Corey could not touch his money. But perhaps sensing that a divorce was imminent and the money faucet would be turned off, Corey simply took out a $2 million policy on Eric and then killed him. And then shortly after that, in order to help her sons deal with the loss of their father, who she killed, she wrote a grief book about it and sold it for a profit. Police say Corey had been working for weeks to figure out the right fentanyl dose to give to her husband. On Valentine's Day that year, Corey had given Eric a poisoned sandwich that had fentanyl in it that she attached a love note to, but it obviously did not kill Eric. He just broke out in hives. So Corey got a stronger dose of fentanyl, she put it in his drink on March 3rd, and this time it worked. The story that Corey told first responders when they arrived to hopefully try to save Eric was that, they had had this celebratory drink, and then they went to bed, and then she had gotten up to see her son, and then, when she came back at 3 a.m., Eric was cold to the touch, and she called 911. But in reality, after she poisoned her husband, and he's laying there still on the bed, slowly dying from this overdose, she just got up and paced around the house for several hours, Googling things like how to destroy electronic evidence and luxury prisons for the rich in America. These searches were, of course, the highly unusual and suspicious things that the police saw when they looked through all those devices during the initial part of the search. But as much as it made them think Corey likely had something to do with this, they didn't have enough to actually arrest her. However, after Corey published her grief book and went on this big tour promoting her grief book, Eric's family, who's watching this happen on TV and listening to the radios, they just couldn't take it. It disgusted them because they secretly believed that Corey had killed Eric over money. They didn't like Corey to begin with, and it just felt like she did this, and now she's profiting on Eric's death. And so family members began reaching out to police in Utah, and they said, "You really need to look into Corey. We think she killed Eric. This whole grief book thing is a joke. She's a killer." Ultimately, it was those calls from Eric's family to the police, combined with Corey's very unusual and suspicious search history and electronic activity on the night that Eric died, that allowed police to arrest her at her home on May 8th, 2023. Corey, who denies any wrongdoing and says she did not kill her husband, is currently charged with aggravated murder, which could lead to the death penalty if she's convicted. She's being held without bail while she awaits trial, and her book, Are You With Me?, is no longer being sold on Amazon. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes.